I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm a professor of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham in the UK and at Georgetown University in the US. And my work is really on the role of religion in national and international politics with a focus on Islam, but not only. I really try to compare different ways that religions, not only Islam, are impacting either domestic or international politics. Religion influences politics all the time. It doesn't mean that you need to have religious parties or religious people involved in election. But if you look at politics not only as an electoral competition, you see that religious ideas or values have impacted the way that we think of institutions, that we think of community in a broader sense. So if you look even at the history of Europe, the pivotal moment for modernization in politics is the end of the war of religion and the beginning of the Westphalian system. So what happened there is that the king came over the Catholic Church and said, as a king, I have the right to guide people on everyday life, on the mundane, because before that, the church had the right to guide you in the immanent and the transcendent. These are religious categories that we still use. Today we just think that the only thing that is left if you're a secular mind is immanent. But the immanent is a religious category. So even the secularization process came out of a redefinition of what is religion, both at the temporal level and also in the spiritual sense. So what happened is the way that we think of religion today as spirituality, as values that concern only me in my intimacy or in my place of worship, this comes from a very specific interaction with political institutions. But we've seen it like universal, and we think they have nothing to do with each other, while the history is a little more complex. And if you go outside the West, the interrelation is even more complicated, because when you export the nation and the state everywhere, every religious tradition had to readjust to that in the Muslim world, in China, in India. And it's a sort of given that religion and politics don't mix, because that's what we learn in our national histories across Europe. But the reality, even in the Western European countries, has been more complicated than that. Even today, if you look at the institutional level, everywhere in Europe except France, you see involvement of state institutions in regulating, interacting with religious organizations. Not because they want to change their doctrine, but because it's part of what makes you a member, a legitimate member of the national community. Why do people pay taxes based on their religious membership? This is what a French person cannot understand. Why do you have an Anglican church that is, where the Queen is also the head of the Anglican church? I do not call this complete separation of religion and politics. I'm not sure that Trump personally is so religious. I'm sure that he is a very opportunist political man. So, for example, we know clearly that he is completely aware that part of his electorate is evangelical. So he will please, quote unquote, this part of his electorate. For example, if you look at his decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, it is not only out of, I would say, his genuine kind of, conviction. It came, and not from the lobbying of evangelical groups, not of Jewish groups, unlike what people think, that have been pushing for this recognition of Jerusalem as a major, center, not only for Jews, but for all Christians around. So, and if he does it, I don't think he is convinced that it's a spiritual way for him to achieve something, but it certainly is a very efficient way to maintain some kind of connection with very religious groups in American society. And that's when we are in Europe, we don't understand that. Because in Europe, we are very secular in the social interaction. So we do not automatically think of the very strong political role of religious groups. And that's part also of the challenge of what is secular. America separates state action, institution, and religious institution. But at the social level, religion is very present. You cannot be a good citizen if you are not a member of a religious congregation, which would be impossible to understand for someone living in France, the Netherlands, or Germany. I would be a little more mitigated with that. But at least, you know, even the UK, people see themselves as rational citizens without automatically connecting their civic action to religious identity or belonging, while it's not the case for the majority of Americans. And that's what he's banking on, because once you have this kind of awareness, it's very easy to have policy, you know, that limits the rights of sexual minorities, or that put limits on women's rights based on abortion or contraception, because this is not a theoretical debate. This is something that Americans are struggling with every day. The question of refugees, immigrants, and clash of civilization in Europe is key. I think there is a connection here that is based not only on the recent influx of refugees from Syria. In Europe, we have been talking about these issues for several decades, actually, because Muslims are at the center of three major, I would say, level of challenge for Europeans, not only Germans. The first one, indeed, is that since the end of World War II, most of immigrants have a Muslim background. It doesn't mean that all Muslims are immigrants, but the most important flux of immigration to Europe in the last 50 years have come from Muslim countries. So when Europeans talk about immigration issue, it's a proxy for Islam. So it happened that the refugee crisis fits very well in this long time pattern, you see. So this is already one reason. Well, if you look just to compare with the US, the immigration issue in the US are not about Islam, even after 9/11. So already it creates a more, I would say, manageable kind of room for discussion than it does in Europe. Second issue, Muslims, immigrants are coming from a very lower skill, low level of skills and education. So they have a huge gap to bridge with the mainstream society. So lots of issues on socioeconomic issues, on disenfranchised area, either by income, education, or housing, most of the time align with the residents of Muslim population. It's true in France, it's true in the UK, it's true in the Netherlands, and to some extent in cities in Germany, not everywhere, but in some big cities in Germany. So it means that everything having to do with urban planning, urban development, socioeconomic issues, more or less will intersect with question of Islam. And again, if I compare with the US, most of Muslim immigrants in the US have no problem whatsoever of socioeconomic integration. Actually, they are located at the higher upper echelon of American socioeconomic ladder. So it makes a big difference. The third issue is ethnic and multicultural. It happens that in every European country, the Muslim immigrants have not only issues with socioeconomic development or education, they also come from a very specific ethnic area. In the UK, it's most of people from the Indian subcontinent. Before being Muslim, they were South Asian. You know, what does it mean, South Asian? Either Pakistani or Indian, but this was the vision before they became Muslim. In France, it was a typical North African. Now nobody talks about North African, we talk about Muslims. And in Germany, it's the same thing with the Turkish immigration, you see? So, and this reinforces the anxiety. So if you cumulate these three together, you have a continuous matrix of issues and debates that can never go away, because if you look at the last 50 years, none of these issues have been really solved. So the refugee crisis exacerbates all these elements and reinforce the idea that Islam indeed is a problem. And that fits indeed very efficiently in the clash of civilization dialogue, or lack of dialogue, I would say, yeah. The idea of integration would be, but it requires a lot of political courage, because it's much easier to surf on this wave of, you know, anti-Islamic sentiment. But it would be to disconnect all these three issues and make them a broader kind of topic for all elements of society. Instead of talking about immigration through the angle of Islam, why we don't talk about immigration? Because it happened that in the last 15 years, immigration has also diversified in Europe. If you look at new immigrant countries like Italy and Spain, not all immigrants are Muslims. You have people from sub-Saharan Africa, you have people from Latin America. So why we don't put, even at the European level, a broader discussion on immigration issues that do not limit our understanding to Muslim population? But you need courage to do that. I don't think we are ready to do that. If we look at socioeconomic integration, the disenfranchised population are not only Muslim. You have people who are indigenous who are struggling with. And actually the young white man, as the Brits call him, he is a neighbor of the Muslim, but he will go through the extreme right movement, and the Muslim could go through the radical Islamic way. So instead of looking at this as two different or opposite paths, why we don't look at what are the conditions in this particular context that explain this kind of, you know, trajectories. And it means that you have also to give more legitimacy to religion in public space. That it's something we have a hard time doing. You know, Muslims happen to be the most visible religious group, but does it mean that religion has left all Europeans? So if we look at religious legitimacy or the legitimacy of religious practice, it should encounter or encompass all other religious groups, not only the Muslims. You know, the debate on circumcision, for example, that happened in Germany a few years ago, it was targeted against Muslims, but there are also Jews who do circumcision, and then it became a debate on what is the legitimacy of such a practice, and I think it's happening now in Iceland. So this is exactly the point. Instead of looking at a practice because Muslims are doing it, let's open up the debate and see what are other religious practices that can be debated across religious groups, instead of looking at Muslims only. But again, I would say this is easier said than done, because you need more political courage to go against this continuous accumulation of immigration, ethnicity, and socioeconomic issues.